3 weeks after old Mr. Park's funeral, Emily was in the middle of her shift as a waitress when they walked in. The bell above the door, usually a cheerful jingle that signaled the arrival of regulars looking for eggs and burnt toast, seemed to choke on its own sound, producing a dull clatter that drew eyes from every corner of the diner. It was raining, a relentless gray drizzle that had been slicking the streets of Chicago since dawn, but the three men who entered were impossibly dry. They moved with a synchronization that felt predatory, stepping out of the damp world and into the smell of frying bacon and stale coffee as if they owned the oxygen in the room. Emily paused, the coffee pot hovering over a ceramic mug, her arm aching slightly from the weight of it, a sensation she usually ignored after 6 years of waiting tables at Sal's. She was used to the rhythm of this place, the predictable ebb and flow of tired nurses, construction workers, and students nursing hangovers. But this was different. The silence that rippled outward from the door was heavy, pressing against her chest. 2 of the men were broad, wearing dark suits that strained against thick shoulders, their eyes scanning the room with professional disinterest. Between them stood a younger man, perhaps in his early 30s, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than the diner's annual lease. He was handsome, with sharp, angular features and hair swept back with severe precision, but his expression was cold, a blank mask of indifference that made Emily shiver despite the humidity of the kitchen behind her. He didn't look like he belonged here. He looked like he had taken a wrong turn on his way to a boardroom or a funeral. Emily set the coffee pot down on the burner, wiping her hands on her apron, the fabric stained with the day's labor. She took a breath, centering herself, her dark curls pulled back in a practical bun, her brown skin glowing slightly under the harsh fluorescent lights. She walked toward them, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the linoleum, a sound that felt absurdly loud in the sudden quiet. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice steady though her pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against her throat. The man in the middle turned his gaze toward her. It wasn't aggressive, exactly, but it was heavy, as if he were weighing her soul and finding it wanting. "Are you Emily?" he asked, his voice low, smooth, and accented with a precision that suggested years of international schooling. It wasn't a question. He knew exactly who she was. The man didn't wait for her confirmation. He gestured toward the corner booth, the one near the radiator, the one with the cracked vinyl seat that had been taped over with silver duct tape. It was the booth old Mr. Park had occupied every single morning for 4 years. The visual connection hit Emily like a physical blow. She remembered the way Mr. Park would shuffle in, his wool coat too big for his shrinking frame, his eyes disappearing into the crinkles of a smile that he only offered to her. He would sit there for hours, nursing a single cup of green tea she brought in specifically for him because he hated the diner's coffee, calling it mud water. Now, this stranger, this sleek, terrifying man, was sliding into that same booth, his movements fluid and commanding. The 2 large men remained standing, positioning themselves like statues near the entrance and the kitchen door, effectively sealing the room. The few customers remaining in the diner lowered their heads, suddenly very interested in their scrambled eggs, sensing that looking up might be dangerous. Emily felt a wave of protective anger rise up, mixing with her fear. That was Mr. Park's booth. It felt sacrilegious to see this cold figure occupying a space that had been defined by warmth and quiet struggle. She approached the table, her notepad tucked into her apron pocket, though she knew he wasn't here to order the lunch special. "I'm Emily," she said, standing firmly at the edge of the table, refusing to let her posture slump. "Who are you?" The man placed a leather briefcase on the table, the metal clasps clicking loudly. "I am Park Jae-sung," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "I am the son of the man you knew as Mr. Park. And we have a great deal to discuss regarding the assets he foolishly left in your possession." Emily blinked, the words not quite processing. "Assets?" Mr. Park lived in a studio apartment above a laundromat. He counted out coins for his tea. He wore the same cardigan until the elbows wore through. She looked at Jae-sung, searching for some resemblance to the kind old man she had known, but found only the sharp angles of a stranger. "I think you have the wrong person," she said softly. "Your father didn't have assets." He had a library card and a cat. Jae-sung's lips twitched, a humorless micro-expression. He opened the briefcase. "You have no idea who my father was, do you, Emily?" The lawyer, a bespectacled man who had slipped in behind the bodyguards and whom Emily hadn't even noticed until he sat down next to Jae-sung, began to spread papers across the sticky table. The documents were thick, bound in blue legal covers, the text dense and incomprehensible from where Emily stood. She felt a sudden, sharp headache blooming behind her eyes. This felt like a trap, a surreal nightmare where the mundane poverty of her life was colliding with a world she had only seen in movies. The lawyer began to speak, his voice droning and nasally, listing statutes and clauses, words like undue influence and mental incapacity floating through the air. But Emily wasn't listening to him. She was watching Jae-sung. He was watching her hands. She realized she was wringing her apron, a nervous tic she tried to suppress. Her mind flashed back to 6 months ago. It had been a Tuesday. Mr. Park had been trying to open a packet of crackers, his hands trembling so violently from the Parkinson's he tried to hide that he had knocked his water over. He had looked terrified, humiliated, waiting for someone to yell at him. Emily had simply walked over, placed her hand gently over his shaking ones to still them, and whispered a joke about the table being thirsty. She had cleaned it up without breaking eye contact, maintaining his dignity when he felt it slipping away. She remembered the way he had looked at her then, with a profound, silent gratitude that weighed more than any tip. Now his son sat there, looking at those same hands as if they were thieves. "You think I stole from him," Emily said, cutting off the lawyer mid-sentence. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a steel core that made the lawyer snap his mouth shut. Jae-sung looked up, his gaze unreadable. "My father was a complicated man, Miss Emily. He abandoned his family in Seoul 20 years ago. He vanished. We assumed he was dead until the embassy contacted us regarding his remains. And then we find a will, drafted 3 months ago, leaving the entirety of his Chicago holdings to a waitress he barely knew." He leaned forward, the expensive fabric of his suit whispering against the vinyl. "This isn't just about a bank account. It is about legacy. And I do not let my family's legacy fall into the hands of strangers who prey on lonely old men." The accusation hung in the air, gross and heavy. Emily felt the heat rush to her face, not from shame, but from indignation. She thought of the winter coat she had bought him from the thrift store when she realized he was layering 3 sweaters to stay warm. She thought of the nights she had walked him home because the ice on the sidewalks scared him. She hadn't known he had a family. He had never mentioned a son. He had only spoken of the birds he watched in the park and the books he read about history. "Holdings?" She laughed, a short, dry sound that seemed to startle the lawyer. "You think I preyed on him?" Emily asked, leaning in, ignoring the way the bodyguard near the kitchen took a step forward. "Your father sat in this booth for 4 years. He spent Christmas here because he had nowhere else to go. He spent his birthday here, eating a slice of pie I paid for because no one called him." She felt tears prickling her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give this man the satisfaction. "I didn't know he had money. I didn't care. He was my friend. And if he was so important to this legacy of yours, where were you? Where were you when he couldn't tie his own shoes? Where were you when he was coughing so hard he couldn't breathe?" The silence that followed was absolute. The lawyer looked terrified, shifting his papers as if they could protect him. Jae-sung didn't blink. He didn't look angry either. He looked studied. He was observing her outburst with the clinical detachment of a scientist watching a reaction in a petri dish. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold lighter, turning it over in his fingers, the metal clicking rhythmically. He did not answer her question. Instead, he signaled to the lawyer to continue. The lawyer cleared his throat nervously. "The bequest includes the deed to this building," the lawyer said, his voice trembling slightly. "Not just the diner. The entire block. The apartment complex upstairs, the laundromat, the corner store. All of it." Emily stared at him, the floor feeling suddenly unstable beneath her feet. The diner? Mr. Park owned the building? The owner, Sal, had always complained about the landlord being a ghost, a recluse who only communicated through a P.O. box. It was Mr. Park? The realization made her dizzy. He had paid for his tea, with coins he fished out of a ragged pocket, all while owning the ground she stood on. Jae-sung watched the shock register on her face. It was the first time his expression softened, just a fraction. He seemed to be looking for the lie, the act, the moment where she would reveal she had known all along. But Emily's confusion was total. She backed away from the table, her hands trembling now. "I don't want it," she whispered. "I don't want any of it."
Take it.
I have to get back to work." She turned, fleeing toward the safety of the kitchen, the swinging door shutting off the sight of them, but she could feel Jae-sung's eyes burning into her back until the metal door swung shut. She braced herself against the stainless steel counter, breathing hard, the smell of grease and dish soap grounding her. Sal, the owner, was chopping onions, oblivious to the transfer of power that had just occurred in Booth 4. Emily closed her eyes, trying to reconcile the image of the shivering old man who loved crossword puzzles with the secret landlord who had a son that looked like a movie villain. She couldn't square it. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. When she finally worked up the courage to go back out to the floor, the booth was empty. The papers were gone. The men were gone. But on the table, sitting precisely in the center of the taped-up vinyl, was a business card. Heavy stock, black with gold embossing. Park Jae-sung, CEO, Hanval Group. And underneath it, a single, crisp $100 bill.
Not a tip.
A message. Or perhaps, a test. She stared at the money, feeling a cold knot in her stomach. They weren't done. She knew, with a sinking certainty, that they were just getting started. The next day, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a humid, sticky heat that made the windows of the diner fog up. Emily arrived early, hoping to get through the prep work before the morning rush, but the bell rang at 8 a.m. sharp. She looked up, expecting the usual delivery of bread rolls, but it was him.
Jae-sung.
This time he was alone. No bodyguards, no lawyer. He wore a different suit, navy blue this time, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone. It was a calculated casualness that made him look even more dangerous. He walked straight to the corner booth and sat down. Emily froze behind the counter, a rag in her hand. The diner was empty except for old Mrs. Higgins eating her oatmeal. Emily walked over slowly, her heart thumping. "We don't serve lobster here," she said, her voice sharp. It was a defensive reflex. She expected him to mock the place. Jae-sung looked up, his face impassive. "Green tea," he said. "And whatever he ate. The special?" "No," Emily corrected automatically. "He didn't eat the special. He ate oatmeal with sliced bananas and a side of rye toast. Burnt."
Jae-sung, not that. That.
Then that. Emily hesitated. She wanted to kick him out. She wanted to scream at him for disrupting her life, for making her question the friendship she had cherished. But she was a waitress and he was a customer. She turned on her heel and went to the kitchen. When she returned, she placed the mug and the bowl down. She watched as he looked at the food. He didn't eat immediately. He stared at the steam rising from the oatmeal. He picked up the spoon, his manicured fingers looking out of place against the cheap silverware. He took a bite. He chewed slowly, his face betraying nothing. "It is bland," he stated. "Your father had high blood pressure," Emily said, wiping the table next to him, though it was already clean. "I made him cut down on salt. He complained about it every day for 4 years, but he ate it." Jae-sung paused, the spoon halfway to his mouth. He looked at the empty seat across from him, as if trying to visualize the ghost of the father he hadn't seen in 2 decades.
"Why?"
he asked quietly. "Why did you care? You are not family. You are not of our world." Emily stopped wiping. She looked at him, really looked at him. Beneath the expensive haircut and the arrogance, she saw a flicker of exhaustion. "I don't know about your world," she said. "But in my world, when someone is lonely, you sit with them. When they're hungry, you feed them. It's not a transaction. It's just being human." Jae-sung looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. For a moment, the air between them crackled with something that wasn't quite hostility, but an intense, quiet curiosity. He didn't understand her. And that, Emily realized, unsettled him more than if she had screamed. He was a man who understood leverage, power, and debt. He didn't understand a kindness that came with no price tag. He ate the rest of the oatmeal in silence, leaving the money on the table. He didn't leave a tip this time. He just nodded at her, a small, barely perceptible incline of his head, and walked out. Emily watched him go, feeling a strange tension in her chest. She realized then that Mr. Park hadn't just left her a building. He had left her a problem. A very dangerous, very broken problem named Jae-sung. The following Tuesday brought a different kind of storm, one that was silent and bureaucratic, as Jae-sung effectively set up a temporary office in Booth 4. He arrived at 9, just after the breakfast rush, accompanied this time only by the bespectacled lawyer, leaving the muscle outside in a black sedan that idled ominously at the curb. Emily watched him from behind the counter, the rhythmic hiss of the espresso machine providing a backdrop to her anxiety. He spread blueprints across the table. Blueprints of her block, she realized with a start, and typed furiously on a slim laptop. He didn't order her around, but his presence sucked the oxygen out of the room. Regulars who usually lingered over their second cup of coffee paid quickly and left, sensing the invisible walls he had erected around his corner. Emily finally approached with a coffee pot, not because he asked, but because the ritual was her armor. She poured the dark liquid into his cup, and he paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He didn't look up, but he spoke. "The plumbing in the upstairs units is 60 years old," he said, his voice a flat, observational monotone. "The roof requires structural reinforcement. The electrical grid is a fire hazard waiting to happen. My father was a slumlord." Emily stiffened, the pot heavy in her hand. "He kept the rents low," she countered, her voice low but firm. "He knew everyone by name. He fixed Mrs. Gable's radiator himself last winter because he didn't want to raise her rent to hire a contractor. He wasn't a slumlord. He was just doing his best." Jae-sung finally looked up, removing his reading glasses with a slow, deliberate movement that highlighted the exhaustion etched around his eyes. "His best resulted in a liability nightmare," he replied, but there was less bite in his tone than before. He looked around the diner, his gaze lingering on the chipped paint of the ceiling and the worn linoleum. He lived in filth. He died with millions in overseas accounts, yet he lived here, fixing radiators. "It makes no sense." He looked at Emily, really looked at her, as if she were a puzzle piece that refused to fit. "You defend him, even now when you know he lied to you about who he was." Emily set the pot down on the table, ignoring the lawyer's sharp intake of breath at the breach of etiquette.
He didn't lie, she said softly.
"He just didn't tell me everything. There's a difference. Maybe he didn't want to be the man with the millions. Maybe he just wanted to be Mr. Park." Jae-sung scoffed, a short, sharp sound, but he didn't argue. He took a sip of the coffee, grimaced slightly, perhaps out of habit, or perhaps because the taste was growing on him, and turned his screen toward her. "These are renovation plans," he said. "If you are to keep this building, you cannot keep it as a ruin. I will not allow my father's name to be attached to a collapsed building." He was taking over, presuming, managing. But beneath the arrogance, Emily saw a strange, twisted form of care. He was trying to fix the building because he couldn't fix the relationship. 2 days later, the dynamic shifted from the public theater of the diner to the intimate silence of the second floor. Jae-sung had demanded access to his father's apartment, the studio directly above the laundromat next door, and Emily, holding the only set of keys, had no choice but to accompany him. The stairwell was narrow and smelled faintly of dryer sheets and old wood, a scent that made Emily's chest tighten with memory. She unlocked the door, the mechanism sticking slightly, requiring the jiggle and twist maneuver Mr. Park had taught her. The door swung open, revealing a space that seemed suspended in time. It was a single room, sparse and meticulously clean, with a single bed made with military precision, and a wall of bookshelves that sagged under the weight of history books and birdwatching guides. The afternoon sun filtered through the sheer curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stillness. Jae-sung stepped inside, his expensive shoes sounding loud on the hardwood floor. He stopped in the center of the room, looking around with an expression that vacillated between confusion and disdain. "There is nothing here," he murmured. "No safe. No documents. Just this." He walked to the small kitchenette, running a finger along the Formica counter. He opened the refrigerator. It was empty save for a jar of pickles and a carton of expired milk. Emily stood by the door, feeling like an intruder in her own memories. "He liked it simple," she said, hugging her arms around herself. "He said having too many things made his mind noisy." Jae-sung turned to the bookshelf, pulling out a worn copy of a field guide to North American birds. He flipped it open, and a photograph fluttered to the floor. Emily moved to pick it up, but Jae-sung was faster. He froze, staring at the small, rectangular image. Emily stepped closer, peering over his arm. It was a photo of a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, standing in front of a fountain in Seoul, looking serious and stiff in a school uniform. It was Jae-sung. On the back, in shaky handwriting, was a date from 25 years ago. "He kept this," Jae-sung whispered, his voice cracking, a fissure in the marble facade. "He left us. He never called. He never wrote. But he kept this in a book about sparrows." The silence that followed was heavy, not with threat, but with the suffocating weight of lost time. Emily saw the tremble in his hand, the same tremble his father had when he was nervous. She reached out, instinctively, placing a hand on his forearm. The contact was brief, but he didn't pull away. "He didn't hate you," she said, her voice a quiet certainty in the dusty room. "He was afraid of himself. He told me once that the people he loved were better off without his shadow falling on them. I didn't know he meant you. I didn't know he meant a son." Jae-sung lowered the photo, his jaw tightening as he fought for control. He carefully placed the picture back in the book and shelved it, turning his back to her to hide his face. "We are done here," he said, his voice rough. "Lock up." The revelation in the apartment changed the atmosphere in the diner. Jae-sung continued to come every day, but the entourage of lawyers and guards began to recede, leaving him exposed in a way that seemed to unsettle him. It was late on a Friday, the dinner rush having tapered off into the quiet lull before closing, when the reality of his other life finally breached the sanctuary of Sal's. Emily was wiping down the counter, exhausted, while Jae-sung sat in his usual booth, nursing a tea he had been nursing for an hour. His phone rang, not the professional chirping of his business line, but a harsh, jarring buzz from a burner phone he kept in his inside pocket. He answered it immediately, his posture shifting from relaxed to coiled steel. He spoke in Korean, his voice dropping an octave, becoming guttural and sharp. Emily didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was violent, decisive, and terrifying. The air in the diner seemed to drop 10 degrees. The few remaining customers looked up, startled, sensing the sudden violence in the corner. Jae-sung hung up and stood, his movements abrupt. He looked at Emily, and for a second, the mask was gone. His eyes were wide, dark pits of adrenaline, and something that looked like panic. "I have to go," he said, tossing a stack of bills onto the table without counting them. "Lock the door behind me. Do not open it, for anyone. Not even the police.
Just go home, Emily. Now."
He didn't wait for a response. He stormed out into the night, the bell jingling with a mocking cheerfulness. Emily stood there, the rag dripping onto the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the shadow Mr. Park had spoken of. This was the darkness he had run halfway around the world to escape. She moved to the door, locking it and flipping the sign to closed, her hands shaking. Through the window, she saw a black SUV screech to the curb, saw Jae-sung get in, saw the flash of metal that might have been a gun before the car peeled away into the Chicago night. She realized then that the inheritance wasn't a gift, it was a burden of protection. Mr. Park hadn't just left her a building, he had left her the safe haven that his son could never inhabit. He had given her the peace he couldn't give Jae-sung, perhaps hoping that one day the two would meet and she could share a piece of it with him. She sat in the booth he had just vacated, the warmth of his body still lingering on the vinyl, and waited for the fear to subside, realizing she was no longer just an observer in this story. 3 days of silence followed, during which Emily worked in a state of distracted tension, jumping every time the door opened. When Jae-sung finally returned, he looked like he had aged 5 years. There was a bruise blooming along his jawline, poorly concealed with makeup, and his left arm was held stiffly against his side. He walked in during the mid-afternoon lull, the diner empty of the lunch crowd. He sat down, not in the booth, but on a stool at the counter, directly in front of where she was refilling the sugar dispensers. He looked diminished, the expensive suit slightly rumpled, the arrogance replaced by a weary resignation. "I have drafted the transfer papers," he said, sliding a thick manila envelope across the formica. "It is all there. The title, the deeds, the renovation funds I promised. It is yours. Legally, irrevocably yours." He didn't look at the envelope, he looked at the coffee machine. "I am returning to Seoul tomorrow. My business here is concluded." Emily looked at the envelope, then at him. She saw the pain he was hiding, the physical and the emotional. She didn't touch the papers. "You're running away," she said.
Just like he did.
Jae-sung let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I am not running. I am surviving. My world does not allow for nostalgia, Emily. It does not allow for sitting in diners and drinking bad tea. It consumes. My father knew that. That is why he left. He didn't leave to save himself. He left to save me from becoming him. But he failed. I am exactly what he feared." Emily reached across the counter, ignoring the professional distance, and placed her hand over his. His skin was cold. "You aren't him," she said firmly. He was a gentle man who made himself small to fit in a world he didn't understand. "You are a strong man trying to break a world that wants to crush you. But you don't have to do it alone. You don't have to leave. The building, it's big. There's space. You could stay. Not as the boss. Just as a son. As a tenant." Jae-sung looked at her hand on his, then up at her face. His eyes were wet, a shocking vulnerability that he quickly blinked away. "I cannot," he whispered. "But thank you. For seeing him. And for seeing me." He pulled his hand away gently, leaving the envelope between them. "Keep the building, Emily. Make it warm. Make it the place he wanted it to be." 6 months later, the scaffolding finally came down from the facade of the building. The brickwork had been pointed, the windows replaced, but the sign above the diner remained the same: Sal's. Emily stood on the sidewalk, wiping her hands on a fresh apron, looking up at the apartment windows on the second floor. They were clean now, adorned with flower boxes that Mrs. Gable had insisted on planting. The diner was busy, the hum of conversation and clattering plates spilling out onto the street. It was the same rhythm, the same grind, but the weight of it felt different now. It felt anchored. Inside, the corner booth was occupied by a group of college students debating philosophy, unaware of the history etched into the vinyl seats. Emily walked back inside, the bell jingling its familiar greeting. She went behind the counter and checked the mail that Sal had tossed there. Bills, flyers, and a postcard. It had no return address, just a postmark from a remote coastal town in South Korea. On the front was a picture of a dense, green forest. On the back, in elegant, sharp handwriting, were 3 words: "I saw a sparrow." Emily smiled, a small, private expression that softened the tired lines around her eyes. She tacked the postcard up on the corkboard behind the register, right next to the faded Polaroid of Mr. Park at his birthday party. She picked up the coffee pot, feeling the familiar ache in her shoulder, and turned to the room. The coffee was fresh. The toast was burnt. The world kept spinning. But in this small corner of Chicago, the ghosts had found their peace, and the living were finally, truly home. She walked toward table 4, ready to pour.